and welcome to episode 193 of The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike. My name is Stanislav here in Chicago, and joining me from historic Oak Park, Illinois, it's the Godfather, the Barbecue Daddy, Old Graybeard, Mr. Creative, the one and only Dave Harbarger.
That's Mr. Creative Director to you.
You're right.
Today's the day where we get to find out if I'm merely a creative director or if I can possibly be a creativity director. We'll see. I don't know, though. Results inconclusive so far. But we have someone very special here to help me with that.
Someone very special indeed. No, it is not Shane. Shane is still on the southern tip of the shoe-shaped country of Italy. I think he's in the heel right now. But we don't need him because we've got returning friend of the show, Zach Ryle, Manacymbal. Where are you? I just see a hazy fog. I see a parrot on your shoulder.
Yeah, I'm in the beautiful port of New Orleans, Louisiana. So far from my home in sunny, beautiful Canada, where it's always spring break. I'm currently full of shrimp po' boy and a delicious rum cocktail. And I am ready to talk about creativity, being creative, and diving down.
Now, I also see you're holding a 4-foot tall plastic cup with a pink liquid and a green straw.
Yes, it's something like a yard or a double yard. I don't know what kind of wacky measurement this is. It might be weighed in stones, the contents might be in gills, which I thought was something that a fish had, but now I'm just a little bit confused about your American measurements. I went to the Starbucks here. Their iced venti cup is 26 ounces. Venti means 20, but apparently it means 26. The Trenta cup is like 32 ounces. I thought that meant 30. We got to get Min Gucci on this because your standards, I don't know. It's just all over the place.
I didn't even know that those words meant literally anything. Funny. But you are currently, and we were talking about this a minute before off mic, you are actually calling us from a boat right now.
Yeah, I'm literally on the cruise ship right now. I'm watching guests walk by the piano bar where I have ensconced to myself. It's one of the quietest places on the ship, except between the hours of 9 p.m. and 1 a.m. where it's a raucous party.
Amazing.
Nice.
Yeah, with R-rated language and your favorite pop songs sung on piano by one of our wonderful piano bar entertainers.
Oh, that sounds a lot like our podcast.
Oh, yeah.
R-rated language
absolutely.
and a lot of pop songs.
Yeah, good pop references and the best band names that you've never used. The current band I'm working with is called From Outer Space, which I believe you'll appreciate the story of, while we were in rehearsal, sometimes certain members of the band have to disappear for a while and to do other little tasks around the studio. So we were rehearsing without a vocalist, and we were playing, what's that? I Will Survive. And I just started singing the lyrics From Outer Space over and over again. And that became the band name.
Perfect.
Love it. Love it. And you've been on this boat for a little over 7 months. Now, is boat offensive? Do I have to call it a ship?
So some people who work on ships are very adamant that they are ships and not boats. For me, being more of a seaman myself, I like the common parlance. So I'll call it a boat. I'll call it a tub. I'll call it a tanker. I'll call it just anything, sometimes a cage.
Vessel.
Yeah, vessel, a tube, a floating tube. So, whatever strikes my fancy. I like to be poetic about it rather than technically correct.
And now as winter approaches ever so rapidly, are you returning to Canada anytime soon?
Yeah, so my contract ends on October the 22nd, and very crazily and luckily for me, I'm going to hit the ground running, go home for 3 days, and then hop on a plane to Vegas, where I will, for the first time ever in person, meet my Serum Visions co-host, Jiggy Wiggy, Arun Singh, in person.
Wow.
Nice.
And we're going to go to the Bacchanal. That'll be on the actual evening of my birthday. And then the next day, I'm going to get to compete in one of the modern beta draft qualifying events at the Magic 30 anniversary event. So I'm really excited about all of that. And if there is anyone who is a fan of me, or even people who aren't fans of me, who wants to shout at me in person rather than just on Twitch, you'll be able to do that.
Amazing.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've been on a boat for a while. I've seen you make occasional appearances in other pods and remained active on Twitter, of course. I feel like this is a good opportunity to maybe like catch you up with a little bit of what's been going on in Modern since you've left 7-ish months ago. A lot has happened.
Yeah.
Everyone's playing 4 or 5 color decks now. Like it's a very soupy format. In your pet deck, Creativity, Indomitable, is arguably tier 1 of the best strategies in the format. You did it. You saw this coming. You were ahead of the curve. And that's why we're having you on, to help us wrap our head around this deck dive that has always puzzled Dave and has always sort of eluded me for some reason. I've never tried it in Modern until now.
Well, I've had to catch myself up on the most recent iterations of it and all the modern technology and how the format has progressed. And one of the best ways to do that is by listening to the Dive Down podcast every single week.
Oh, shucks.
As well as, of course, the wonderful pair at Dominaria's Judgment. Love those two.
Yes.
Dom Harvey is a personal acquaintance of mine, if not a friend. And also I love all the work we get to do on Faithless Brewing, which has sort of partnered up with Serum Visions to bring you the most competitive and the most speculative brews in the Modern and Pioneer format for the last couple months. So luckily, I've kept myself in touch, and then I've been doing a bit of cramming, playing a lot of matches with different versions of Creativity so we can talk about the differences that currently exist and maybe some of the pluses and minuses of those decks in the current Modern format.
But before we do that, it's everybody's favorite time, Stan. It's time for housekeeping.
Shout out to the newest patrons to join the Dive Down Nation. We have Ashton K and Walter A. Thank you both for joining our little community, our kind slice of the internet. Also, some new reviews came in since the last episode. Thank you to Mark B, Mike A, and Andrew C for leaving some kind words on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to support our show, you can do so directly over at Patreon. Find us on patreon.com/thedivedown. You can also support us while playing Magic with the Mana Trader subscription to rent Magic Online cards. If you use promo code TheDiveDown15, you'll get 10% off your first 2 months of a Mana Trader subscription. And if you don't play Magic Online, you can also get a discount on some paper cards from our friends over at Nerd Rage Gaming. If you use promo code DIVE8, you'll get 8% off your order at NRG. We don't even get a cut of that. This is just our friendship with NRG extended to you, our friends, the listener. Enjoy it. Now, without further ado, let's talk about a very creative deck.
Today's the story of a deck that has floated around for just a long time at this point. I spent a little bit of time researching last night, kind of the first mentions I saw of this, specifically the first one that I could find from Zach, actually. But let's talk about the namesake card for 1 second, because that's really what this deck revolves around. And how do we say this first word? Indomitable?
Indomitable. Correct.
Indomitable?
Indomitable. That's how I would say it. Indomitable sounds ridiculous to me, but if you're British, maybe that's correct. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, but they say aluminium too, so it's
Yeah.
So Indomitable Creativity, XRRR Sorcery. It is a mythic from Aether Revolt, little set.
I think it's the original Kaladesh, but it is Aether Revolt.
Yeah,
You're
it's
right.
Aether Revolt. Yeah,
You're right.
Weird set that not a lot of people paid a ton of attention to at different points in time, although it does have Walking Ballista in it as well. Destroy X target artifacts and or creatures, not just yours. For each permanent destroyed this way, its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until an artifact or creature card is revealed and exiles that card. Those players put the exiled cards onto the battlefield and then shuffle. All right, so Zach, Stan,
Dave.
mostly Zach.
Oh.
When did you first see this card and think you could do something with it? Do you remember?
So I am not the original progenitor of a quality Indomitable Creativity deck in Modern. I do remember Zanman, Lawson Zandy, who was streaming for a while. When Eldraine came out, he tried a couple of different Dwarven Mine, Polymorph, Transmogrify, Indomitable Creativity decks. It seemed like a natural fit with Indomitable Creativity costing red, and Dwarven Mine requiring 3 mountains. They kind of felt like a match made in heaven. I saw him do this a couple times. At the time, he was flipping into Emrakul. So that's the first time it was ever something that I saw anyone doing. And at the time, it was not something I was at all interested in.
Shout out to Lawson, by the way. Lawson, one of the first listeners of the Dive Down who reached out to us, one of the first members of our Slack back in the day. Good guy, Lawson. If you're out there, shoot us a note.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was going to university and suddenly he started appearing less and less online, as happens with people with big life changes. And I would guess that someday he'll return to the game and we'll be happy to see him at that point because he's just a phenomenal player, innovator, great energy, just fun guy to watch be ridiculous. So good friend. Hope you're doing well.
So the power behind this deck, I think it's interesting when you think about the decks that creativity has sort of led to. When I was looking at early lists and thinking about other decks that I've seen, a lot of people have talked about the idea here being creativity is kind of a spell-based combo deck that helps you kind of cheat a giant threat out. A lot of times it's Emrakul that changes over time. But at its core, the idea is something that I think is almost more akin to in my mind, I was looking at this, I was like, is this modern sneak and show? Is that what this really is? Like at the very beginning? Because the shells look similar to me. The spells kind of do similar things. They have different constraints, but it's sort of like, how do we sneak in the biggest threat we can possible in modern?
Yeah. And the one huge thing that really made it appealing to me was that it's kind of like a one card combo. Because Dwarven Mine getting to hide in your mana base where you can always fetch it out to get your target, that was a big deal to me, the way that the deck played out. It was really, really useful for you. You only had to draw the card Indomitable Creativity, and then you could combo off of having your fourth land, which consequently was how much mana you needed for a Creativity X1.
It's almost like they were made for each other. And who knows, maybe they were. Maybe they were.
Because it almost sounds to me like it wasn't Indomitable Creativity in and of itself that made this deck possible, but it's really Eldraine and the printing of Dwarven Mine that kind of gave us this resource that let us combo with creativity without having to dedicate a specific spell slot.
Absolutely. And even more to that, the card that really launched this was the card Velomachus Lorehold and a brewer by the name of Freak You Nasty, who I believe still streams from time to time. Not a super huge amount because he's a full-time, he's got a full-time job, but he does still stream. So he put together the cards Indomitable Creativity, Dwarven Mine, Velomachus Lorehold, Time Warp, and Savor the Moment. And that is probably, Dave, if I had to guess, the first time you've seen me associated with those cards.
Wow. There we go. And so we're going back to Strixhaven at that point. Yeah, it's interesting. So when I was looking into the history of this deck a little bit, I didn't quite find the Velomachus decks again. I definitely remember them now that you mention it. But one of the first things I found is an article that you wrote on Faithless Brewing in May of 2021 called Modern Cookery with Spaghetti Through the Breach with Indomitable Creativity. And so this is one of those lists that really made me think, it's about having 8 enablers for being able to cheat Emrakul out into play to be able to make the deck work. Is where a lot of these lists that you were developing at that point did. Do you remember a lot about this article, or kind of like what was going on when you guys put this together?
It's so funny because I can't remember if that was before or after the one that I wrote about Velomachus. I want to say it was before, but
okay.
I'm not entirely sure, but there was a point there where I was kind of interested in just like over the top ways to cheat in Emrakul and kind of exploiting some redundancy there. But when I think of the Indomitable Creativity deck as it is now, that really not having something like Through the Breach is kind of better, because Through the Breach incentivizes you to play 4 copies or somewhere around that of one of your big threats. And the nice thing about Creativity to me is that you've always been able to play less numbers of clunky combo cards.
So, Zach, that's a really interesting point, because I almost feel like as we start talking about the individual cards in the deck and its plan, and without really getting ahead of myself, like I almost feel like we keep seeing this tension with the deck's evolution of like how many of these big chonkers we want in the main, right? Like your point here is that Creativity like incentivizes you almost to play fewer of them rather than something like Through the Breach, whereas something like Fable the Mirror Breaker, which is becoming more and more common in creativity lists, almost gives you a reason to play more of them, because you now have this like really excellent card advantage engine that lets you pitch away extras that you can like sometimes recur with something like a persist, or even just shuffle back into your library if you are running Emrakul too.
Yeah. I would say before Velomachus, just the idea of getting an Emrakul into play and whether you could attack with it immediately or not, that was a known strategy that existed in Modern that never had a great build. There was never a way to do that in a way that was particularly competitive with the rest of the format. And that's why I want to highlight Velomachus as being one of the big early breakout things for this deck, is because it could very easily be a one-shot kill that could happen as early as turn 3. Or that deck was the version that I played a lot of, that I got multiple challenge top 32s, a few top 8s. Freak You Nasty on the very first weekend he ever took it out, he made a top 8. And I think that deck put creativity on the map in a big way. And then if we're going to jump to the middle history here, what is very, very important is when Modern Horizons 2 came out, I had an 8-0 run in a challenge playing Velomachus Creativity. That got a lot of people's attention, even though I immediately lost in the top 8. And so that included
getting to the dance counts just as much, Zach. It's not just...
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. It was a huge accomplishment for me, but the biggest part of it was the fact that now other people took it seriously. And when they did, we had people like Zan Syed coming along, and a lot of other people, Mr. Rabe, who's been a big part of developing different versions of this deck. So then they took it to this middle period, which was the Serra's Emissary Emrakul version. So this was a version that was specifically trying to resolve Indomitable Creativity X2 and get exactly 2 permanents into play, which are Serra's Emissary and Emrakul. And the reason is because then it protected your Emrakul from a lot of the new cards that had been printed, or even some of the old cards that could possibly make Emrakul less appealing. There was also Unholy Heat was just released, and that made Velomachus Lorehold a lot less appealing. All of a sudden, your opponent could have a 1-mana answer for it.
Yeah. And there's some other cards that got picked up from Modern Horizons 2, of course. Serra's Emissary was there. This is where you start to see people talk about Archon of Cruelty. More on that later. Hard Evidence becomes a token generator of some choice in these builds, kind of after Modern Horizons 2. Fire and Ice, everybody's new favorite tempo card in the format. Somehow Fire and Ice is in every deck these days. And even Prismatic Ending is a card that I saw showing up there just as a piece of interaction for the deck to have. And this was also the era where, when you get towards the end of 2021 is where you won a Modern Challenge on Creativity, and we had you on the show to talk about the time. And also Steve Perlman came in second in Vegas with a Creativity deck as well. That was, I think, pretty close to the deck that you played in that challenge, if I remember right.
Very much so. And I got to talk to him a couple of times on Twitch, and I think even at Vegas, Eyelash TV, I believe, was the one who got some footage of that, and she even got an interview with him, and he said specifically my challenge finish was one of the things that inspired him to register that deck. Yeah, that was the sort of height of the Emrakul Serra's Emissary version, and it was just a sweet spot in the metagame where that was one of the top decks, definitely. Like a really good tier 2, I would say. It wasn't actually tier 1, but it was like a tier 2 that could take a whole challenge down.
So early 2021 is when people really start to pick up the deck a lot more. It's when I bought the cards for the deck in February, started getting the pieces for it because I thought maybe it's a thing I don't want to be left out of. And then this is also the point where it felt like we're really starting to go from Serra's Emissary and Emrakul to Archon of Cruelty being the target of choice for Creativity. What do you think about that? And maybe why do you think that might have happened around this time?
It's mainly because of the popularity of the 4-color control deck. So Emrakul Serra's Emissary could beat that deck, but you did have a tough choice to make. You had to name creature or planeswalker with Serra's Emissary, and both those choices could be beaten, either by your opponent just playing Supreme Verdict or playing a Teferi to bounce your Emissary and then solituding your Emrakul, or there was a number of ways that deck could be well set up to beat your Creativity X2 plan. And with the Creativity decks in all sorts of variations, I've talked about this a long time, and there's even variants that don't get played, like at all, where you can flip in like Leveler and Thassa's Oracle and instantly win the game on the spot. So what you're choosing with different Creativity builds is what do you want to happen when you resolve creativity, and how big do you need that creativity to be? So creativity for X2 was the Emrakul, Serra's Emissary deck's entire... It wanted to do exactly that. You could creativity for more than 2, but you would that was just insurance against removal. You would always get exactly 2 things into play. Whereas the Velomachus version only really ever wanted to creativity for 1. Putting 2 Velomachuses into play, not a great idea. And the nice thing about Archon is that if you creativity for X equals 1, all the way up to X equals 4, all of those things it's like a sliding scale of payoff. And even if you get immediately Supreme Verdicted or what have you, you still got an Archon trigger. And those are huge, especially depending on the matchup. So you were mentioning before that you had the problem against 4-color where they could just Solitude it. But it's like getting that Archon trigger should put you in a pretty good position, unless you were like quite far behind. So forcing your opponent to 2-for-1 themselves when you just like 3-for-1 them, that usually puts you in the driver's seat. For a very complex number of reasons, Archon became more popular. One of the other things is because 4-color was so popular, Burn was popular, because Burn was one of the few decks that people figured out that like you could just outrace 4-color a lot of the time. Well, Burn actually is able to beat Emrakul, Serra's Emissary a lot of the time. Archon helps against Burn because it's got a late game trigger.
Totally makes sense. And then kind of the rest of this year, I think, has really been about 2 cards being added to the deck. One is Fable the Mirror Breaker, and the other one is Leyline Binding. You know, we did have an era earlier this year where Teamer Creativity was the really popular one. It's certainly the one that I tried for a minute. You lose your Teferis, you lose your kind of any shot at Prismatic Ending or something like that, your removal, but you go like fully stack based, essentially try to play Remand, a couple Lightning Bolts, and then kind of you're just a red and 6 deck from there basically. But now, mostly from Leyline Binding, we're back to 5-color kind of being where it's at. The deck adding a tool to it. And now here we are where it's gaining in popularity a lot. It's one of the top 3 or 4 decks by meta share suddenly these days. It's also really high as far as win rate goes, depending on the day. I mean, I believe at Energy, we saw that it was plus 60 or right at 60% win rate in Energy Minneapolis. It won the event, and people are playing it a lot. Stan, How many mirrors did you have online when you were testing this deck? Did you have a lot of mirrors?
I had none.
You had none? Zach, are you seeing mirrors now?
I've played against this deck an absolute ton. I even played against Doom Switch this weekend while he was double queuing the challenge. So I was just play testing just to play test in the league, and I could see that he was double queuing in the challenge and in the league, playing creativity in both. And he put up a top 32 finish in one of the challenges. So a lot of really great players, especially of like mid-range control decks, are experimenting with this. In the early days, Wafotapa was one of them, but recently I know the Teamer versions, one of its big wins was Mr. Yellow Hat himself, Gabe Nassif, taking it. So it's very popular right now. One of the other decks I'm considering for Vegas, because I'm crazy, is Colorless Prison, because I feel like it'll be a lot more unexpected, but running into creativity a few different times, I'm like, maybe not. If creativity is going to be a popular deck, these Leyline Bindings are problematic.
That's interesting. This deck is actually one of those that evades me a lot online. I can probably count on one hand how many times I've matched a creativity opponent in leagues versus paper, where when I was doing the RCQs over the summer during season 1, like almost every single RCQ I got paired up against at least one creativity player.
Yeah, it's it's definitely hitting its stride, and as it is hitting its stride, we do have a few different flavors, and there hasn't been any conclusive moment of some of these versions are the de facto stock version. So when you do run into Indomitable Creativity, you might run into a full 5-color version that is playing the good white cards, which will almost definitely include 4 Leyline Binding, and may or may not include Teferi. It seems like the jury's still out. I'm seeing numbers as low as 0 and as high as 2, or even 3 right now. But I think Teferi's positioning overall, I guess, is not that good, even though it seems like some of the Cascade decks are getting more popular. Okay, so we've got the full commitment to white. Then we have the teamer version, which is basically just the only version that isn't, or I wouldn't say the only version, but that's that same deck that is not playing white. Usually plays some copies of Explore, and that helps you get a little bit more of a linear leg up. And then the least popular version, but it still has some validity and is still floating around, is this Grixis version, which doesn't play Wrenn and 6, plays additional discard outlets in Tainted Indulgence, and as well as playing some offensive discard in the form of Thoughtseize, and plays usually 3 or 4 copies of Persist. So it's half creativity, half Reanimator, because you're playing 4 copies of Archon of Cruelty anyway, and they get discarded a lot to Fable the Mirror Breaker, or in this case, Tainted Indulgence, or Prismari Command. Then you might as well register some copies of Persist to cheat it in early from time to time.
One thing that's super interesting for me over the last couple days or week or so is seeing these 5-color versions that are splashing Persist as a 1-of or a 2-of, as they try to up the number of let's call them creativity effects, I guess polymorph effects. Basically, they're kind of like, okay, Persist in some number is okay, Transmogrify in some number is good. You're always going to have your 4 creativity, but it looks like moving up to 5 or 6 of these effects, even a 5-color deck, seems to be becoming a little bit more of a standard across these two.
Yeah, so we'll touch on those individual numbers in a second here. But yeah, the de facto version right now is it's all about Archon, and then occasionally you'll see a sideboard secondary threat. I'm not 100% up to date on exactly the plan with these that people are trying to move forward with, other than Emrakul will help you against Mill. But sometimes you see a 1 of Serra's Emissary on the sideboard. Sometimes you see a 1 of Iona. I'm not 100% sure if people's idea is they're going to cut all their Archons and put that 1 of into the deck, or if they're putting it in addition to Archons as redundancy in threat. Because from time to time, you'll run into a deck like 4-color control that just has so many pieces of removal that you actually might need more than just the 4 Archons.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about how the deck works. Dan, you have any other questions before we hop into that?
No, I don't. But I think it's a good idea to really highlight the mission and kind of lay it out plainly, because all of these iterations all have the same focus. And they're essentially tempo control decks that are looking for a way to cheat in 1 or more Archon of Cruelty or other big game-ending creatures. Sometimes as early as Game 3 if they're playing something like Explorer Growth Spiral, but in general it's usually on turns 4 or later.
Yep, that's absolutely correct. And Fable just sets you up so well for these. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But the card Indomitable Creativity is so different from your regular polymorph effect because it's an X spell. And dodging creature removal, single target creature removal, is a huge deal in Modern. I can't remember the last time that there haven't been a lot of decks that pack a lot of creature removal, and cards like Ragavan have made that like the absolute mood of the day. Most decks are playing cards that they intend to use to kill Esper Sentinels and Ragavans, and those will kill Dwarf tokens and Crab tokens. So having a polymorph effect that isn't fizzled by a single removal spell is very important.
So even though I categorize it as a tempo control deck, it does have this combo angle that's pretty critical to its win condition. You hear stories about Dwarf token beatdowns, but I feel like those are very, very rare. And in general, you need an Archon or one of your big finishers to actually close out a game. So let's talk about the combo package specifically. We've talked about Indomitable Creativity. Next to that, I think it's really important to call out is Dwarven Mine, which is a land, a non-basic mountain from Eldraine, enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more other mountains. And if it does enter the battlefield untapped, you create a dwarf token.
Yeah. Super interesting phrasing there, which means that if there's an Archon of Emeria in play or anything else that causes the Dwarven Mine to enter tapped, you will not get the dwarf no matter how many mountains you had in play. So just watch out for that if you're playing this deck for the first time and you run into, was it the Thalia Heretic Cathar or
right.
Archon of Emeria or any other reason why your Dwarven Mine will enter tapped.
Wow, great point. I hadn't thought about that in a while, but it's good to remember corner cases. Yeah.
Very, very weird corner case, but if you're playing paper, the game won't remember that for you. Yeah, watch out for that one. Hard evidence has been less popular recently. I'm a little surprised by that, but I guess I shouldn't be, because since everyone's packed up so much on removal, trying to use hard evidence to stop your opponent's Ragavan is a bit of a pipe dream right now, and it's really bad against Esper Sentinel. So hard evidence might come back into vogue at some point, but right now it's actually I don't see many copies of it floating around at all.
So we were talking about this this hard evidence on the Dive Down Discord today with some of the people who've been playing. Scott Polera, who has been doing well in NRG and is around the Discord a lot, mentioned that one reason that people aren't playing hard evidence is, as you mentioned, Zach, because of removal. But another thing that's possible is because the clue token used to be a really resilient way to make sure that your token that you turned into a target couldn't be interacted with. But now that lots of people are playing Leyline Binding, in addition to the occasional other kind of secondary artifact removal, that's not as much of a possibility as it used to be, and it's not that hard to interact with the clue token as it used to be before. So you have, in addition to maybe the card not being as useful, people wanting to kill Ragavan instead of just blocking it, you're also having this kind of like, well, the clue token doesn't do as much as it did before either. So
yeah. 100% agreed. Treasure tokens and clue tokens used to be really great because very few decks packed main deck removal for it, that they could use at instant speed. That's a big thing. Having someone prismatic ending your treasure token feels great. Having someone Leyline binding your treasure token when you had targeted with creativity, not so great. So yeah, that has definitely fundamentally changed a few of the card choices here. And then of course we've got the namesake creature that we want to cheat into play. We might as well tell the listeners the exact text if they don't remember. It's 6 black for Archon of Cruelty. Creature Archon with flying. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, target opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, discards a card, and loses 3 life. You draw a card and gain 3 life. So it's a 6/6. Interesting points here is, like a Titan, it's when it enters and attacks. And secondary interesting point is that it does target. So I have had people sideboard in things like Leyline to block that. Yeah, Leyline of Sanctity, thank you. To block that because they thought that would help. I did end up winning that game recently where they did that because, of course, they were functioning down a card. But you can block it with that. You can block it with Veil of Summer. There are a few valid ways to block the Archon triggers.
I guess if someone does that to you, you still get to draw a card and gain 3 life, which is nice.
If the trigger gets fizzled, no. You do need
so it's the whole trigger.
Target. Yeah, the whole trigger. So if you don't have a valid target, you get nothing. So Leyline blocks the entire Archon trigger. If your deck wants to block Archon triggers, try these options.
You still have to kill it because you're going to get attacked by a dragon,
right?
Basically,
a 6/6 flying Archon. Yeah, it's you're not done, but it is pretty big to block the trigger. What you've labeled here nicely as backup plans. So we've got Transmogrify and Persist, and these basically exist in different ways to give you a bit of redundancy on the card Indomitable Creativity. The highest number of Transmogrify I've seen is 2. It's pretty popular. I've seen 1/1 splits, 1 Transmogrify, 1 Jace the Mind Sculptor. I know on MTG Grindcast there was great player who I don't remember the name of, but he won one of the RCQs with creativity. He said he really didn't like Jace in the current metagame. So Transmogrify is fine. I'm not a huge fan of it, but it makes sense, and I've won games with it, so I have more faith in it than I otherwise would have. It has to target creatures only. It can only target 1, so it's the most vulnerable version of an Indomitable Creativity, but it's fine. It's fine redundancy. Persist, though, is something I'm actually really interested in testing in both the 4 or 5 color versions, depending on how you count the colors. Just as a 1 to 2 of in the main deck, but maybe even some more copies in the sideboard. It just allows you to go a little faster. It allows you to run a little bit lighter. And you are a Wrenn and 6 deck, so sometimes people try to attack your graveyard with cards like Rest in Peace or Leyline of the Void, but relatively speaking, it feels like it's a great card to just have access to. So that's a very important question for me, is how many copies of Persist do I want to play in an Indomitable Creativity list?
Yeah, I played one and I liked it quite a bit. Personally liked it more than Transmogrify for the reasons you explained, or at least the shortcomings you explained for Transmogrify. And I feel like what Persist did is that it almost created this new like sub combo within the game, and one of the new key enablers to this deck, which is Fable the Mirror Breaker, where it essentially made every mode on Fable like actually really good, where if you draw an Archon, you can pitch that to Fable in search of Indomitable Creativity. Or if you draw a Persist and you don't have any ways to pitch Archon, you can just as easily pitch that Persist, and it's usually no harm done.
And something I need to talk about here, and I know it's a hot button topic for today, so that makes it great for the podcast. Let's talk about Wrenn and Six. We don't talk about Bruno, but we do talk about Wrenn and Six, because since the days of Velomachus taking turns, the original Indomitable Creativity deck, to now, I believe this is one of the most important, most powerful cards in this deck. I don't think there's any question about its position in the modern format anymore. But this card allows you to frequently mulligan to 6, 5, or even 4, as long as you have a copy of Wrenn and Six in your hand, with confidence. And I've won a crazy number of games just resolving Wrenn and Six on the play, or even on the draw sometimes. Of course, there are linear decks against which it's not super useful, but yeah, Wrenn and Six. Huge deal for these decks. The Grixis version, I think one of the things that's holding it back is it's decided not to play Wrenn and Six, and that just makes it a pretty medium combo deck. And one of the things about it is that even if you resolve one Archon and then it gets removed, if you have a Wrenn and Six in play, that thing is going to carry you, and you're just going to win the game on the back of the Wrenn and Six Ultimate. I cannot tell people enough you should be playing 4 copies of this card in your creativity deck.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of those things where you can play this card for a while and sort of, I feel like, still not realize how amazing just doing the +1 over and over again is. And then like a couple weeks ago, I woke up and I was like, whoa, I really do win just by hitting my land drops every turn. And I don't know if I've ever done the emblem in Wrenn and Six or been in a position where I could make it happen. You know what I mean? But it's always just about the fixing and occasionally pinging something that's in the way that really can make things happen. I mean, I played a match the other day against Dredge, actually, where pinging away Silver Smoke Ghouls actually turned out to be decisive as far as getting the most value out of my Archon triggers as I could. So it's just like so much stuff here, so much at this card.
Absolutely.
I hope it doesn't get banned. Maybe it's going to get banned. Yeah. I don't know, but
I really hope not. But if it does, I would understand it. And on the other, one of the easiest ways to feel how great Wrenn and Six is for you is every now and then it'll get spell pierced or like spell snared on turn 2, and you're like, oh, I don't have a plan anymore. I was gonna have a good game, but now I won't, and it's entirely because my 2-drop got countered, and that shows you just how powerful it is. It does also team up wonderfully with, as you just mentioned, Fable of the Mirror Breaker. This is a card that I could not believe that this was going to be good enough in this deck, that this was going to be good enough in this format. When you read this card, it seems so underwhelming, especially when you compare it to something like Seasoned Pyromancer. But of course, for creativity reasons, this deck can't play Seasoned Pyromancer, which would be a great card for it, but you can't play it. But Fable of the Mirror Breaker does work for you. And you're right, every single part of it is insane. Wrenn and Six giving you extra lands in hand means that when you hit Chapter 2 and you can discard up to 2 cards, and then you draw that many, means that any extra lands in your hand, you can just throw them because you're going to pick them back up again.
Exactly.
Same with Prismari Command, which also has a similar loot mode.
One of the most interesting things to me about Fable is that when you talk about cards that are going to get countered, like I feel like I've seen so many players, I watched like Manguchi do a league with creativity recently. I watched another streamer do it. And when you get to turn 3 and you don't know if your opponent has interaction to be able to counter your Teferi or kill your Teferi or do something like that, just saying, you know what, it's turn 3. Let him counter Fable of the Mirror Breaker. I'm just going to play it. There's so much. I think there's even just value in being like, here's this card that's good, but I sort of don't care if you counter it because I have other good cards as well is pretty interesting thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if they don't have stack interaction, having to actually deal with Fable is such a pain for them. I even had someone today Leyline Binding the Fable and leave the token, the Shaman token in play, which was... I mean, sure. I'm sure they had their reason for it, but it's like, yeah, because if you just go after the token, you only got the token, but the Fable's still there. So It's pretty phenomenal. The fact that when it flips on Chapter 3, I actually think Chapter 3 is by far the least powerful part of it, but the fact that you can then start like kiki-jikiing Archons, there's every now and then your opponent's forced to interact with it, and more importantly, it's another body for you to creativity or transmogrify.
I will add that I had one win in one of my leagues. It was a game win that I think got me the match win, but where my creativities and my Archons were non-viable. I think my opponent was able to answer them, but I managed to get 2 live reflections of Kiki Jiki on the board. And just like having that plus a bunch of mana and just making a ton of reflections on my opponent's end step, it actually kind of does like a reasonable Kiki Jiki impression, because then you have all these hasty 2s, and the more mana you have, the more hasty 2s you have on your opponent's turn. That to me was a more realistic plan B almost than hard casting an Archon or like trying to beat down with a bunch of 1/1s and running 6 pings or something else.
I have had a similar experience with with just the Shaman token and a reflection of Kiki Jiki. Although what you are mentioning in particular is if you have 2, what are they called? Reflection of the Mirror Breakers?
Reflections of Kiki Jiki.
Reflection of Kiki Jiki. So once you have that, you can, at an end step, use one to copy the other. Then you get a new hasty version, which can then copy another, which can then copy another. So at a cost of 1 mana each, you get a bunch of hasty 2/2s. So if you had 5 mana, you're attacking for 10, or 14, because you already had the 2 extant copies. So yeah, that's a very neat interaction I haven't gotten the chance to use yet, but just for anyone looking for tips and tricks for this deck, that is definitely a way you can win a game.
And for anyone looking to expand their vocabulary, great use of extant.
Oh, thank you. I don't know when that made its way into my vocabulary, but I'm happy about it.
It sounds like a ship term of some kind.
I definitely was using it before. By the way, we're currently turning away from the port of New Orleans, and we're about to start floating down the mighty Mississippi. So out the window there, you can see this building-sized ship is rotating. Beautiful. Yeah.
I like that bar piano that wraps around.
Yeah. It's decorative, but it's nice. So Prismari Command was a card that when I left, I remember this card was a little bit under fire. There was a lot of people who did not like this card very much in different versions of Creativity. For a few different reasons, I think it's turned around a bit in perception. I'm glad that it has. It's useful in a lot of different matchups. The most common, or let's just go through it really quickly because it's 1 blue-red instant. Choose 2. You can deal 2 damage to any target. You can have target player draw 2, then discard 2. You can have target player create a treasure token, or you can destroy target artifact. Dave has a note here that he thinks it's one of the worst cards in the deck and almost always sides it out in games 2 and 3, and I definitely think that's a totally reasonable take. There's a lot of matchups where it's not great, but the thing is, it's never bad. And just having that card flow, being able to create treasure tokens is a huge deal in any kind of controlling matchup. Just having 1 or 2 extra mana to leverage against an opponent. I know you folks have been Murktide players from time to time. Ragavan running unchecked from turn 1, just giving you 1 extra mana per turn. It's just totally backbreaking sometimes.
I totally agree with that. It's never awful, right? But that's a reason that it's ripe for sideboard stuff too, is that it's good for game 1, and then you can figure out what holes you need to plug on games 2 and 3. And this card goes out a good amount, and then there's a couple other cards in the deck that go out a good amount as well that we can talk about a little bit later.
I'm more reluctant to keep it post board if I'm on the play. Like I think it's a good option to take out on the draw, unless like against something like Hammer where I need the artifact removal. But it being 3 mana, I think is kind of like the knock against it. And because you have other cards at 3 mana that are valuable, including Fable, that I'm much more reluctant to side out. I think that's kind of what makes Prismari so easy to take out in certain games.
Yeah, 100% agree. I found I've been boarding out a copy or 2 of Fable the Mirror Breaker sometimes because I think because it's sorcery speed and it's very kind of chunky and vulnerable, sometimes I prefer to have a little bit more of the freedom that is Prismari Command, even in matchups where it's not great. Sometimes I think it being like a C-level card is fine because it's instant, because I want to dictate the times where we're interacting.
I can see that, and too. Then we've got makes sense.
I don't know if I'm right or wrong yet. I think there are probably people who are much, much more experienced and much more up to date with this deck than I am. But I'm just saying this is where I feel like I'm at with it. And it hasn't felt like I've been misstepping heavily. I've got a reasonable win rate with this deck, considering how out of touch I am with Modern. I think I'm on an average of 4-1s with most of the leagues.
You have a lot to teach us because, wow, we'll talk about our personal results in a little bit, but yeah.
Yeah. And then we've got a smattering of other control and protection spells. Teferi Time Raveler is one of the most, we've mentioned it before, that this card is largely not in these decks, but every week I see 1 or 2 copies floating around in some of the lists. So I think there's something to be said about Teferi.
I think Teferi does a couple of things, and why you can understand a 4 to 5 color version of this deck is incentivized to play it. If you're worried about Murktide or blue-white or other control decks, like Teferi is such a good protection spell for your combo turns, just because like there's a lot of games that come down to whether or not Indomitable Creativity resolves will more or less determine whether or not you have a path to victory. So I think there's that, of course, but it also has the proactive support, right? If you're worried about Living End, Rhino's Calibrated Blast, Teferi is just kind of like this such a good silver bullet in matchups where we're basically ships moving in the night.
I also liked Teferi a lot in some of the previous versions, in that you could play Ren and 6 on 2, ping something to kill it, play Teferi on 3, bounce the next thing that they played, and all of a sudden you're setting up all these planeswalkers, and they're like, well, I have to deal with those, and you're like, cool, creativity you. So it does put a lot of pressure on opponents to deal with different threats of different types.
Yeah, and not to mention the fact that Cascade is still popular, and having main deck good cards that hate on Cascade is not a bad thing still.
Yeah.
So.
Though I would say the cards that actually make me more confident against Cascade decks in the game ones is Spell Pierce and Fire Ice. The thing about Teferi is it's a 3-mana spell, which is oftentimes too slow. Also, they're well set up to like, oh, you're tapping out at 3 mana? Cool, force a negation. And then they do their thing, and you might be in a little bit of trouble. Whereas Spell Pierce and Fire Ice let you kind of fight on the same axis that they're trying to play. And then Archon is occasionally a decent foil to either they resolve Rhinos first, so you resolve an Archon against them. So that can usually beat a single Crashing Footfalls. And then sometimes there's games where you can make Living End feel awkward because you've managed to discard an Archon, and now they have to worry about their Living End putting an Archon into play on your side of the battlefield.
Yeah, I think for just to put a bow on Teferi, this is another card that can actually be really easy to side out if you don't think 100%, your opponents
100%.
Are ever going to cast a counterspell, or if they're not going to cascade into anything. He is like doesn't really do a lot to support your plan. He's really just there to kind of protect your plan.
Well, I will say some of the most spectacular games I had back in the day when I was playing 4 copies of Teferi, being able to plus Teferi in this deck and hold up an instant speed Indomitable Creativity is bonkers. That's the moment where being able to target your opponent's stuff in addition to your own becomes completely insane. Because they'll go to combat and you neutralize their biggest threat by destroying it and flipping it into another random creature. And then you also deploy a large creature of your own to block whatever else is still coming at you. So there's definitely some real raw power to that in this deck. So I'm just thinking that Teferi in the general meta is probably a mediocre position, would be my guess. And then last but not least and newest is, of course, Leyline Binding. This deck was already basically a 4 or 5 color domain deck in lots of its versions. So Leyline Binding fits in perfectly, basically replaces Prismatic Ending, but is, for the most part, a better card. It's not perfect, but it's mostly better. And again, the jury's out on whether or not this deck needs to play it, but it seems like a very popular choice, and I currently doing my research on it.
Yeah. It's been really good for me just as like a reset button or like a get out of jail free card for sure. The decks that I played. One thing that's interesting to note about fetching with this deck is that you cannot do what 5 color can do really, which is basically Indatha Triome into Steam Vents. so that you have all 5 on turn 2. There's not really a way to make that happen. So just keep that in mind when you're planning out your hands.
Sure there is.
What do you do? Double Triumph?
Yeah, you'd go Rogren on turn 1, and then the second Triumph on turn 2,
It's Ziatora's Proving Ground.
Right. Yeah, that's the one, the Jund one.
Yeah.
So you can do it. It can be done. It does involve fetching double tap. But your Leyline Binding will cost 1 at that point. So
if you go Rogren 1 and then you go the Proving Ground second, you'll have an untapped Rogren, you'll have it up and ready to go. But like you said, it does mean you go double tapped, which can be a little awkward.
Right. And I would only do that if I'm not playing Ren and 6.
It's definitely something you can do.
Yeah, that is the problem too that I noticed. Yeah, the Ren and 6 one.
We've seen the mana bases making different concessions. So some people are playing Ketria Triome, Ziatora's Proving Ground, and a Raugrun Triome. So that's 3 different Triomes. The specific combination of Raugrun and Ziatora's Proving Ground for exactly what you guys were mentioning. And then you can go like Ketria Triome into a shock of any kind to play turn 2 Ren and 6. That's your option there as well, or even a mountain if it's a matchup where you're concerned about your life total.
As long as we're on this control and protection spell section, I want to take a minute to talk about Fire Ice, which we've mentioned in passing, and this was a card that in this particular deck was actually kind of hard for me to wrap my head around because I'm so used to playing it in Rhinos where you're trying to set up the sequence of like turn 2 Ice, turn 3 Cascade. You can't really do that here on that same curve. And it's a little harder, I think, or it can be harder to time an effective ice in a way to like actually get the value you need to protect your Indomitable Creativity turns. But we were talking about it on the Discord today, and again, Scott Polera more or less kind of convinced me of its potential and why it really belongs in a deck like this.
I mean, it's just so flexible. That's...
Yeah. So it's really the flexibility that he kind of spoke to its potential, right? Where, in some cases, if you're on the play, it can add to your very easy win draws, where it provides reasonable interaction early against certain creatures. It can help tap down opponents to force through an Indomitable Creativity if they only have 1 mana up on their end step. And you can also pair it with a Spell Pierce to all but guarantee that your creativity resolves. Compared to something like Remand, it's a lot less flexible too, because while Remand can draw you toward your combo while giving you a time walk, at least Fire gives you a little bit of extra reach. It also can pick off an opposing Ragavan. It can even like answer 2 toughness creatures. I
played against Jim Davis today, and I crushed his Battle of Wits Goblins deck, but he had a really great draw with a Runedvelt Horde Master in game 1, and if it weren't for Fire Ice, I would have lost. But Fire taking out a Horde Master and another Goblin, it's just crazy. The number of times I've double killed like 2 DRCs or a DRC and a Ragavan, like Fire Ice is insane.
It took a minute, but it's certainly become one of those played cards in Modern. If you think about it, it's in 4-color, it's in this deck, it's in Rhinos, like not stuff I thought would happen once it got printed in Modern Horizons 2, but here we are. Somehow that like kind of middle casting cost card is just useful enough. All right, so that's kind of like going through the cards in the deck, what they're for, kind of how we've ended up with the choices that we're at right now. I would love, I think, to just talk a little bit now about maybe we could go to talking about how do we start thinking about how to play this deck the right way. Like, maybe, do you have any thoughts about, I'm asking for a friend here, Zach, how to improve and not lose with this deck as much as maybe some people lose with this deck?
So I think with it being a kind of combo control deck and the pace of Modern at the moment, you want to keep opening hands that have a specific plan in mind. So you want to be able to angle yourself towards a creativity or at the very least like a protected Ren and 6. Once you figure out what matchup you're in, obviously your evaluation of your individual cards is going to change. But for game 1s, you want to try to find a hand that actually points you towards a creativity. And I think if you have enough lands and a copy of Fable of the Mirror Breaker or Prismari Command, that can be good enough. If it's 3 lands, one of those cards, and then like Bolt, Spell Pierce, Fire Ice, that's probably fine. If you have a Wrenn and 6, that's even better. But don't feel afraid to mulligan. If your 7 doesn't have a Wrenn and 6, go down to 6. If your 6 doesn't have a Wrenn and 6, you can go down to 5. And you can even go down to 4 sometimes and then keep Wrenn and 6 and one other spell. But having a definite path forward is pretty important.
So it really sounds to me like creativity is your end game, but it's Wrenn and 6 that's kind of like the backbone of your plan, and a lot of plans can sort of fall apart if your opponent is able to just answer that or delay it.
If you can break up your opponent's game plan a little bit, that works really well. That's where a card like Fire and Ice and cards like Spell Pierce and cards like Lightning Bolt are great. Is just a little bit of disruption to your opponent's early game. It's amazing how much a single Spell Pierce buys you time against any of the Cascade variants.
But on the other side, it's just like, if you're up against creativity and you can answer Wrenn and 6 either like as soon as it hits the board or on the stack, like that sounds like it could be a huge problem for the creativity player.
Absolutely. Especially if you see a mulligan to 5, if they play Wrenn and 6, you hit that thing. Or if you're a Thoughtseize deck, that is often a way to make their game plan fall apart.
So we do see, like from time to time, the Grixis versions cut Wrenn and 6 for more hand disruption or other forms of interaction, or Tainted Indulgence for maybe some added consistency. Let's just say we one day see Wrenn and 6 get banned. Like, this deck gets a lot worse if it can only survive as like a more mid-rangey version that doesn't have like the engine that makes sure you hit every land drop, which is basically critical for you to have any plan at all.
Yeah, I would say it's not a coincidence that the Grixis version overall is less popular, and we're not seeing it make as many appearances in top finishes. So it does not surprise me at all, and I would be shocked to see this deck continue to be as good as it is without Wrenn and 6. But then the rest of the format changes too, so who knows how that shakes out.
Yeah, but like, is your suggestion mulligan to a Wrenn and 6?
Not if you have a hand that's like very clearly functional. So as I tried to illuminate, like if you have like 3 cheap pieces of interaction, 3 lands, and either a Fable or a Prismari Command, that's probably good enough. Because both those cards select you towards having a creativity or a transmogrify. And especially in a game 1, like this is game 1 kind of thoughts. This is when you don't know what you're up against. So 3 pieces of cheap interaction and the chance to get a turn 4 or 5 creativity is often going to be good enough if that's a 7. If it's a 6, okay, it's not as appealing, but maybe that's good enough. If you're on a 5 and it looks kind of mediocre, then go ahead and just go down until you find a Wrenn and 6 or whatever.
Love that plan.
Yeah, right. I mean, if you have to, and I've won a good number of 4-card hands with Wrenn and 6.
So we've talked about this deck in passing in the past. Dave has tried it a couple times, and we constantly make fun of him about how much Dave struggles with it.
I did win some matches this time, though. I just want to be clear, I did.
Yeah, and that's really my question, is just like, you keep revisiting this deck because we make you. How do you feel like you've progressed with it, and what new questions or challenges are coming up for you, David, as you like get a little bit more familiar with it, even if you're not necessarily like getting better with it just yet?
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, one thing is like sequencing land drops is tough in this deck. I mean, that's one of the things that I brought up when I mentioned about the Leyline Binding problem, where you can't cast Wrenn and 6 and have a one mana Leyline Binding ready to go on turn 2. It's tough to get Leyline Binding online and get Teferi going. It's also sometimes really tough to fetch properly and get Wrenn and 6 on 2 and Teferi on 3. You know what I mean? Because it's tough to get a white and a blue mana sometimes. So there is like some options that are limited with that. I think that has cost me definitely while I'm playing. Do you have any thoughts on sequencing land drops, Zach, that could help, just in the generic sense?
It really depends on what deck you're against. Just today, when I was playtesting in prep for this episode, I got smashed by Amulet Titan in 2 games in a row, where basically it was weighing different choices that I had, and it was like, well, how much do I want to like slow down my path to a creativity in order to hedge for like, oh, but if they have the double amulet, I'm just going to die. And the decisions I made in both games had me just like kind of die on the spot on either turn 2 or I think it was turn 4 in another case. But I think that's also just something that happens in Modern basically no matter what deck you play. Occasionally you're going to run into some hyperlinear decks where you get taken apart because you made a certain land sequencing decision. I would say Modern at the moment is just as complex as it always has been, and you just got to keep putting in the reps, and you'll find little heuristics or little examples, little outlying moments where you go, oh, I'm going to do this way because I've seen this situation before, I've died here before, and you make your way out. If you go back and watch some of my challenge runs with creativity, there are a number of times where you just you try to take your percentage play and hope it works out, and that's going to happen no matter what deck you're playing. So I don't have any specific thoughts other than do your homework, as we were talking about earlier. For example, if you want to play a turn 2 Leyline and you want to play it for 1 mana and you want to have your perfect color setup, then if you have Raugrin Triome and Ziatoro's Proving Ground, that is the only way to do that. Know that before you go into those games, because that's something you can know. Knowing all the lands you're going to have access to, that is something you want to know before you're playing games. Like have an idea of like, okay, I'm playing 2 Steam Vents, one Stomping Ground, and 1 Blood Crypt. That's a lot of the times the setup of Shocklands I've seen, and 1 Sacred Foundry. So if I want to be able to fetch untapped white mana, I want to leave the Sacred Foundry in my deck and get the Raugrin Triome early. There's just little moments like that, little level up moments. So creativity, I think, is pretty well positioned. We see it having showings that are, let's say, similar to a tier 1 deck right now, like the consistency with which it's showing up in top 8s, top 16s, top 32s, winning events, all of that. And it's specifically these Archon versions, specifically because you have access to a lot of very powerful sideboard cards, both cheap interaction and different hate pieces. So in terms of my current recent experience with the deck, I would say there's a few very difficult coin flippy matchups, like say Rakdos Skelemental. I want to call it Rakdos Midrange because I really hate calling it Scam. I personally hate calling it Scam.
Please call it Midrange.
Yeah, Rakdos Midrange is fine. Rakdos Elementals, I kind of like that even more because it speaks to one of the very explosive angles that deck is trying to exploit. Everything else in the format, some of the hyperlinear combo decks, I mentioned that I lost to Titan earlier, that can be a very difficult matchup. Or sometimes it's really easy. Boseiju has been a huge pickup for this deck, in that some of the big mana decks used to be a little bit problematic, like Tron, or Titan, and if you get a Boseiju Ren and 6 loop going, sometimes it's child's play, but sometimes it's not. So I know there are some spreadsheets floating around and some data that's been collected on the specific matchups, but I feel very confident going into almost any matchup with this deck because you have stack-based interaction, you have Leyline Binding, which can deal with almost any type of permanent, and Archon of Cruelty can race almost anything.
How about Burn these days?
I mean, I always lose to Burn, so that's a me problem. I will say you are a 5-color deck with a lot of shocks and a lot of fetches, and you are leaning into that. I know some people are playing Turn the Earth in their sideboard right now. I have used that, and I did get matched up against Burn, and I did pull in all the copies, and it felt quite good. So I think that's one of the main points of that card. It's also useful against Rakdos Scam or Reanimator decks. You can take away the target of their Persist or their Undying Malice. I know there was some questions floating around about who was sideboarding that card and why. I think it's that split of being useful against Burn and useful against graveyard cards. Yeah, there are versions right now that are running a 1 to 3 copies, I think I've seen, of Unholy Heat. You do have all the necessary card types to get Delirium. You have some enchantments, you have instant sorceries, and lands, and planeswalkers. So sometimes it's just an extra way to kill Ragavan, like a 5th Lightning Bolt. Sometimes it turns into the upgraded version. So that's an interesting thing to keep an eye on. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if this has a bad matchup against Burn. I would say, again, it probably is close to 50-50, and it gets better, I would think, with copies of Persist.
I feel like, so I got paired against Burn, and I won one match and I lost the other match, and it's kind of awkward because, you know, we were just talking about how important Renin 6 is, and I feel like Burn loves to see a turn 2 Renin 6 that's kind of just like humming. And that was a matchup, perhaps incorrectly, I sided out all of my Renin 6s because I feel like I can't win a game if I'm fetching every turn.
I think that's actually a really good way to approach the matchup. I don't know if the best players of this deck would say it's correct or not. I endorse that. Again, I don't know if it's correct. I don't know if that's the best way to do it, but I think that is something that I would feel incentivized to do myself. I'm not going to tell you it's wrong. I don't have my own specific thoughts and specific sideboard plans together for this deck, so it depends on what you're bringing in, of course. I would definitely want to bring in any and all copies of Nature's Claim for killing Eidolons and for occasionally targeting your own stuff just to gain 4. So if you have any of those floating around in your sideboard, that's a card that is like a sneaky bring in against Burn.
All right, before we wrap up, I have one kind of an esoteric question I'd love to ask you both about this deck that sort of positions it in Modern in general. Okay? What is the deal with a lot of Modern decks right now denying an entire access of the game? In this case, it's just like, we're not running any creatures unless we can cheat it in. And we see that with like Cascade decks not running anything less than 3 mana. Why is that a trend? Like, is that just because like the finishers are so good that it's worth it? Or is this just like a weird moment that we're in that the trend could die out eventually too?
I just think it's powerful cards have restrictions on them, and to make them their most powerful forms, you have to think about what the restrictions are, and so you end up doing things like this to make decks work. I mean, Luris had a restriction when it was one of the best cards. You know, Indomitable Creativity dictates you do certain things to make it work. Cascade does as well in order to make it great, and so I just think that there is a trend of maybe in design of having these cards that have really strong payoffs if you can cleverly crack the right way to make a deck that's functional, that pays attention to restrictions. So I don't think it's a trend on the deck construction side so much as it is people figuring out how to take cards that are powerful and use them properly.
I'm going to give a very glib answer in that it's because Magic is the best designed game of all time. Exactly as Dave was saying, when there are powerful, interesting cards, they have interesting hoops to jump through, and that's what makes this game so awesome. There's not too many things that are like Omnath, where it's just like, this is really, really powerful, and I guess the hoop is paying 4 different colors of mana, but like otherwise it's like, have fetch lands in your deck, I guess, but it's just kind of bonkers.
Yeah, fortunately, right, if there were a lot more than that, that's what leads to bannings that are more clear. I think, but even like Hammer Time is even a deck that has like really powerful payoff, but you have to do the cheaty part. And I think that's just kind of what the game is. You get a large card pool like in Modern, and it's possible to make those plans work really well because of card redundancy over, 20 years of cards or whatever Modern is in total. All right, Zach, again, hope that you have a great final couple of cruises here as we kind of turn away from cruising season, get you back on land for a little bit. And like you said, you'll be in Vegas. We're going to be in Atlanta for DreamHack. I don't know if there's any chance that maybe we could see you down there, but hopefully someday soon we get to meet you in person, Zach, and hang out. And, maybe we get to see you play the drums sometime. That would be cool.
Oh, that would be great. I do have a couple of clips up on my Twitter of me playing drums, as well as I think a lot of them made it to my Facebook for anyone who knows me on Facebook. But definitely there's a few clips on me of me on Twitter playing drums, and that'd be really fun. I am going to go back to streaming during my vacation, so I'll have 2.5, 3 months of time where I can go back to streaming at twitch.com/Manacymbal.
All right, Zach, thanks again. It was so nice to catch up with you. See you again. Glad to hear you're thriving in the open waters, in international waters. Echoing everything that Dave said. Looking forward to seeing you come back to Magic. Hopefully we can reconnect soon. And of course, always excited when you appear on all the other podcasts because you have good insights. Even when you take a break from Magic, I always care to hear what's on Zach's mind. But that does wrap up this week's show. So if you haven't yet, listener, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you get the latest episodes as soon as they come out. And if you use Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and review. If you'd like to submit a question to our podcast or reach out in general, you can tweet us at The Dive Down, all one word, or email thedivedown@gmail.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can join our Patreon over at patreon.com/thedivedown. Shout out to Mana Traders for sponsoring The Dive Down. Sign up for a Mana Traders account using promo code TheDiveDown15, all one word, to get 10% off your first 2 months of renting Magic Online cards. And also get some amazing shaving soaps, body soaps, fragrances, and more over at Barrister & Mann using promo code TheDiveDown15 for 15% off your first order. And last but not least, save money on paper cards over at Nerd Rage Gaming with code DIVE8 to get 8% off your order from them. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. And until next week, get out there and follow Manacymbal.
Very nicely referred to here as the backup plans of Transmogrify and Persist. Hold on, we've got a message from the captain.
We're going down. Repeat
Which
the
is
ship
interesting
is
because
going down.
we're currently in the mighty Mississippi River, which is, I don't think, deep enough to actually swallow this ship. It's like 12 stories tall.
We are converting into a steamboat casino.
It's funny, as we go down the river, there are like some old-timey paddle boats that will pass.
Our power's being drawn down by someone doing a podcast, it looks like. Abandoned ship, someone's doing a podcast on here.